Moreover, Moreover, the report emphasizes the importance of transparency, which is something that is often lacking in the financial dealings behind these projects. Public and private financiers must grapple with the economic viability of these investments while considering the externalized costs to communities, ecosystems, and the climate. Today, our esteemed panel will unpack these findings and explore critical themes, including the financial risks, the value of legal challenges brought against these projects, the environmental and social risks of onshore gas, and perhaps most importantly, trying to answer the question of who truly benefits from these projects. So once again, we thank you for joining us today as we delve into this important discussion on the future of energy, finance, and justice in South Africa. My name is Adelaide Chagopa, and I will be your moderator for today. Joining me are our esteemed panelists who lead us through the discussion, beginning with Leanne Govitsamy, the Head of Programs at CER for the Corporate and Accountability and Transparency Program. She will provide us with an overview of the report, including its context and the key findings. This will be followed by Consilia Dugoro from the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program as well, who will offer a reflection on the challenges relating to access to information and how that affects how we can challenge these projects. Paul Lado from the mining program will offer a reflection on the legal challenges to these gas projects and the current processes, along with Leanne, who will provide more information on the projects. Sipesihle Vundla, a climate and energy campaigner at Groundwork, will reflect on Kinetiko and the community engagement processes. And Armando Ayala from CAT program will also present on financial data and information contained in the report. And finally, Bekomunzi Dean Bebe, the Senior Just Transitions and Campaign Advisor for PowerShift and Dongas Africa campaign, will guide us through the Dongas Africa campaign, as well as offer a regional perspective on the climate, social, and environmental risks associated with gas projects in Africa. The discussion to follow will highlight that the CER and its partners work in a holistic manner in order to challenge new fossil gas projects, challenging environmental authorizations, engaging in shareholder activism, and seeking access to information on due diligence and other environmental and social impacts. We also raise awareness among public and private financiers and challenge them over their continuing financing of climate-risky fossil fuel projects. To this end, our report aims to raise awareness, disseminate credible and factual information, and ultimately advance the just and equitable use of natural resources as part of our constitutional right to a healthy environment. As we go through the discussion, we will engage in about 10 to 15 minutes per panelist and per topic, after which we will engage in a brief discussion with them with some questions, culminating in a question and answer session at the end. Should there be any pressing questions, please put them in the chat and we will engage with them as we go through the discussion. And on that note, I will open up the panel discussion and I invite Leanne to walk us through the report, its context, and its findings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Adelaide. I hope you all can hear me quite well. And welcome again to all who have joined us. We're really looking forward to having this discussion with you today on this really important topic and sharing information about the financial research that we obtained and which is included in the report. We'll add the link to the report in the chat. It is now live on the CER website. And essentially, you know, what I'd like to do now is just provide a little bit of context to this report, to the context of gas development globally in Africa and South Africa. So, and apologies if, you know, I'm repeating things that you already know. I think we're at different stages of understanding where we are in gas development generally. So, you know, to begin firstly by reflecting a little bit on what Adelaide has spoken about as natural gas or fossil gas as a transition fuel. You know, it's something that has been touted as a cleaner alternative to coal, while being capable of addressing, you know, either regional or national energy security and economic growth needs. But if you look at what the International Energy Agency is saying, At a global level, they're saying the golden age of gas is over. So the period of significant growth for natural gas is ending. And so if you look at some of the statistics that we have up on the screen, and which is in the report, around about 40% of global gas demand being for electricity generation, we're already seeing in South Africa, for example, how electricity generation is increasingly moving towards cheaper renewable energy sources. And so this aligns with what the IEA is saying. So they're saying essentially that global demand for gas will peak in 2030 and then decline from 2050 due to the increasing adoption of cheaper renewable energy sources, improvements in energy efficiency, etc. Quite importantly, even the IEA is talking about how fossil gas is not clean and how this links back into global commitments to address climate change. So this is quite an important thing around how fossil gas is often touted in different sectors, especially by lobbyists here in Africa, across the world, as being cleaner. It in fact releases potent greenhouse gases, harmful air pollutants, and importantly, and we'll reflect on this a little bit more as we move forward, drilling for gas contaminates ground and surface water sources, which is relevant for South Africa, given how Southern Africa is already highlighted as being warmer and becoming warmer and drier, according to an IPCC report. So then we've got to look at the economic aspects of this from a global perspective. Stranded asset risk is really immense. The IEA's net zero emission scenario suggests that up to 75% of LNG projects, which are currently under construction or going into construction now, might fail to recover their investment capital. So we must consider then also, what does this mean for the region? In Africa, and we can move to the next slide here, oftentimes we are being told about needing to rely on gas as a transition fuel, needing it to advance our developmental needs, etc. And the question we've got to ask ourselves is, how do we leapfrog gas development, set our own agenda based on our own needs, and not on the extractive practices that have historically not served Africa's development? And so when we think about gas in Africa, this idea of it being needed for baseload electricity sources is often raised. And yet we know that renewables and storage can in fact mitigate the intermittency of solar and wind generation. So that battery capacity is increasingly becoming more stable and even cheaper, actually. So if we look at what Don't Gas Africa have said, and we'll hear from Dean later on this, they've said, if we focus on gas in Africa, it would misallocate scarce resources, lock Africa into obsolete energy technologies and systems, and importantly, delay the provision of universal energy access to millions of people through renewable energy. And so I think it's really significant that we reflect on that regional context. And what does this mean for South Africa? Essentially in South Africa, Sasol has about a 20% equity share, and we can move to the next slide, in the Romco pipeline, which pipes gas from the Pande and Tamane gas fields to its processing plant in Mpumalanga. And they have, for a while now, been speaking about what we have called a gas cliff in South Africa. And I think establishing, therefore, the role of onshore and offshore gas, but we are focusing on onshore gas for today's conversation. So they're saying, look, the Tamane and Pande gas fields are nearly exhausted. There's currently no alternative gas supply. And you're seeing large industrial users also counting on the construction of an LNG terminal in Mozambique to make up for decreased supply. But what is quite significant in South Africa is that the current industrial demand in South Africa does not justify the cost of building this terminal. And so industrial users then argue that in order for that terminal to become economically viable, additional demand should be created through gas to power projects. And you'll see later in how in our explanation and as we take you through the Kinetiko and Tetra 4 projects, the location of those projects to existing potential gas to power projects or existing power stations becomes significant. At the same time, so you have this gas cliff, you've got industrial users calling for this terminal to be built in Mozambique. There seems to be a push for gas to power projects to almost create artificially a demand for gas in South Africa. But the Presidential Climate Commission has said in its electricity planning recommendations that gas to power is actually not necessary at any significant scale to ensure secure and reliable electricity. So, in that context, we've got to be able to question industrial users, the industrial use case for gas, and look at it in that context. So the South African government, however, is promoting fossil gas as a transition fuel through the Integrated Resource Plan 2023, the Gas Master Plan, a 2024 document. These plans aim to secure gas supply through diversification, develop the necessary infrastructure, looking at the conversion of existing power stations to gas, as I've mentioned. And it's interesting, though, because there's a difference of opinion between the Department of Minerals and Petroleum Resources and then the Ministry of Electricity and Energy, where the minister recently said in relation to the gas master plan that in fact that master plan needs substantial revision in order to incorporate public comments. He noted the shortage of generation. He noted that the shortage of generation that led to load shedding had been mitigated through improved plant performance at Eskom. So it's led to us having over 100 days without load shedding. So I think there's a signal that government is reconsidering their approach to gas to power projects, or at least there's some contradiction between different departments, which we need to consider in our own advocacy in challenging some of these gas projects. From an infrastructure perspective, we're aware that the South African government is still, however, planning the construction of pipelines, other infrastructure at ports like Richards Bay, Saldanha, the same ports that Car Powership had won electricity supply contracts for under the REAP program. And those projects have been described recently as being dead in the water. So I think from a gas infrastructure perspective, we need to remember that this requires significant capital investment. Pipelines, floating storage regasification units, conversion of existing power plants, etc. And if we direct that money, right, towards these gas projects, which will take a really long time to build, we're diverting resources from critical sectors, as well as from sustainable and more cost-effective renewable energy solutions. So I think we'll move to the next slide, and we can talk then about our experience at the Center for Environmental Rights in unpacking where we are with onshore gas developments and understanding where exploration is. So the Petroleum Agency for South Africa, they have allocated rights for onshore gas development and exploration and production to about 7 companies. Including Tetra 4 and Kinetiko, which we will speak about, but we've experienced significant challenges in accessing information. And I want to hand over to Concelia to talk us through some of those challenges. Over to you, Concelia.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for that. And I think something to ponder that we can discuss in the Q&A at our quiz portion is how do we envision the report's impact on or at least its findings on the broader conversation around energy policy, economic development, and environmental sustainability. So just something we could maybe have a chat about later. And Coco, welcome. So your portion discusses specifically access to information. And I would say that transparency and access to information are very critical in the matrix of accountability and informed decision-making. So with that in mind, would you please reflect on the challenges you've had, or rather you experienced with getting access to information, and how any of those challenges affect how we can challenge these projects.
Thank you, Adelaide, and good day, everyone. Before I start speaking on the challenges that we've experienced in accessing information, I would just like to start first by highlighting that the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa gives everyone a right to access to information. And we also have the PAIA, the Promotion of Access to Information Act, which has paved the way for a simplified process for requesting information. However, we as CER as we have experienced, in practice, most of our PAIA requests are met with resistance by these government departments and other institutions. Since the sudden surge of gas project applications, we have been actively engaging with the regulatory bodies responsible for petroleum and mineral resources in order to obtain information regarding these applications and projects. And most of the time, our attempts to access this information has been in vain. We engaged with the Department of Mineral and Petroleum Resources, the PASA, which is also known as the Petroleum Agency of South Africa, and the IDC, also known as the Industrial Development Corporation of South Africa. I'll just set out briefly each of the challenges that we have encountered with each of these institutions. Last year, we submitted a PAIA request to the DMPR, requesting for records pertaining to compliance, monitoring, and enforcement processes undertaken by the department with regards to oil and gas exploration or production operations in South Africa. Our request was ignored and never acknowledged, or we didn't even get a response. And we followed up by instituting an appeal as per the PAIA based on deemed refusal. And that appeal was ignored too. And we're now planning on submitting a complaint to the information regulator. And we also engaged with PASA to request for access to environmental authorizations for the various gas exploration and production rights, including those for Renergen and Kinetiko. After almost 2 years of back and forth, we received some of the EAs and more information as needed. And I believe this was due to us attending meetings when we were invited by PASA and being persistent in following up on our requests and fostering a working relationship with PASA, and they have become more responsive to our requests. We also submitted a PAIA request to the IDC for information on the environmental impacts of financial agreements for Kinetiko energy projects. And they refused our request, claiming that the information is confidential and did not give reasons for that, adequate reasons for that. And just to conclude, I would say the level of resistance that we encounter while seeking information on gas projects is alarming, especially considering the significant environmental implications that these projects have. And therefore, we believe that it is essential that we prioritize transparency and public awareness regarding these projects to enable the public and communities that are affected by these projects to engage meaningfully and make informed decisions, and to be able to challenge these gas projects. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Concelia. I noted that the report and what you said highlights significant transparency issues related to the financial and environmental disclosures of these gas projects, especially public access to that information. Since information is critical for any engagement or path that we decide to take and for any of our strategies, what do you think are the risks to us and to those bodies like the IDC and PASA when they resist giving full access to environmental and financial data on gas projects?
I would say the risk to us and most community organizations would be that we are unable to engage meaningfully with these projects or applications, and therefore it is we're not able to properly challenge because we are not informed. And there is reputational risks on the part of the IDC and all that, and because they are required to give this information, and they are supposed to give this information, and if they do not, then they do not comply with the laws. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Concelia. And speaking of challenges, one of the tools we employ when challenging gas projects is a legal challenge. It is critical that these projects adhere to regulatory obligations placed upon them by the law, especially when it comes to environmental authorizations, as these projects pose great risk to people and the environment. Paul Ladder from the mining program is well placed to give us some information on the legal challenges of these projects. And in his discussion with us, Leanne will also contribute by giving us some further background information on the projects. I will invite both Leanne and Paul to please jump in.
Thanks so much, Adelaide and Concelia, for those reflections. So on the Kinetiko project, right, we're referring to it as the Kinetiko project because this refers to a company, Afro Energy, that is in South Africa and 100% owned by Kinetiko, which is an Australian gas exploration company listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, and it is focusing on conventional gas opportunities in South Africa. So it was granted exploration rights for an area of approximately 3,600 kilometers in Mpumalanga. And this is one of the projects that I had referred to earlier as being quite close to existing power stations, and I think being perhaps touted as being a potential source of gas for the conversion of power stations from gas to power, right? And if you look at the 2017 environmental authorization, it specifically addresses the exploration phase, but it states that future exploration and production would require separate authorization and approvals. And I want to hand over to Paul now so he can talk a bit about the scoping process for this project and tell us about his experience in engaging with the Kinetiko project. Paul.
Thanks so much, Leanne. So as it stands with Kinetiko, they currently don't have any production right, and they are still in the scoping phase with regards to a few of the exploration rights. As CER, we have only commented on the scoping report for exploration right 383 that was submitted to them last month. We still await any call for comments on ER 272, ER 271, and ER 270. It's important to note that with regards to ER 272, they have what they refer to as a pilot production project, right? So even though it's only an exploration right, they do have testing for production that is not provided for anywhere in our law, and we are engaging with them regarding their novel pilot production projects. But that is where we are right now with Kinetiko.
Thanks so much, Paul. Yeah, I think we can move to the next slide and we can go into the Tetra 4 project and take some questions on that project later on. Paul is from the mining team, and he and the team have been focusing a lot on challenging these different projects. And the Tetra 4 project is one in particular where I think poses significant risk in South Africa, but also has raised a number of questions for us about the actual viability of the project, actually. So this is a project that is, we refer to it as the Tetra 4 project. It is owned by Renergen, which is listed on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the Australian Stock Exchange, and plans to list later on the NASDAQ. Later on this year, actually. And so their initial plans were to exploit and market compressed natural gas. but those plans stalled, and they've shifted their focus to helium. And so they've attempted to become a major helium producer in South Africa, actually globally, but this has proven to be quite commercially challenging, and I think technically challenging for them as well. So they've missed a number of deadlines. There have been production challenges that have caused major delays. So Paul, can you tell us more about how you've challenged this project and your experience in that? Thank you.
All right, thanks, Leanne. So yeah, Tetra4 were granted a production right, and they're quite a unique company in that they hold South Africa's only onshore production right. They were granted this in 2012. In 2017, they applied to begin what they refer to as Cluster 1, which allowed them to drill for 7 or 19 additional wells. They were granted environment authorization for that. And to date, they have completed all drilling in terms of Cluster 1. Recently, they applied for a further expansion in terms of what they call Cluster 2. Now, this expansion would be massive. They would go from 19 wells to an additional 300 wells. So we were approached by Makua, Mining Affected Communities United in Action, to represent them in opposing the Cluster 2 expansion. In July 2023, Tetra4 were granted environmental authorization to commence drilling in terms of Cluster 2, and our clients, Mejco and Makua, opposed that with our assistance. Now, the basis of our clients' opposition to Cluster 2 was rooted in 6 core grounds of appeal. The first one was the deficiency in Tetra4's assessment regarding the groundwater impacts of their project. We had gone through their groundwater impact assessment, and we had found that there were severe deficiencies with the assessment. They had critical data gaps in their assessments. There were flaws of the modeling, and they had not used site-specific data to assess the impacts of drilling on groundwater. Another ground of appeal that our clients had was the climate change impact assessment that Tetra4 had compiled. Again, we felt a deficient assessment. They had not fully assessed scope 1 and 2 emissions, and there were no scope 3 emissions contained in the assessment at all. Furthermore, the life cycle emissions weren't assessed properly. Now, this runs counter to the Thabamezi judgment, where the court, the North Gauteng High Court in 2017, said that all climate change impact assessments have to be comprehensively done. And we argued that a comprehensive CCIA should include an assessment of all 3 scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, as well as the full life cycle emissions. The third ground of appeal pertained to public participation. As many of you would know, South Africa's constitution provides for administrative justice in terms of Section 33. In essence, it means that people should have the chance to be consulted and to meaningfully participate with regards to decisions that will impact them. Now, Tetra4 had consulted landowners in the region around the proposed project. They had consulted with NGOs and community-based organizations, but farm workers and farm dwellers, people who would arguably be most impacted by the project, were by and large excluded. We argued that their exclusion was a violation of Tetra4's duty to properly consult with the public, and a violation of our constitutional Section 33 administrative justice provisions. So that was the third ground of appeal. The fourth one pertained to need and desirability. In applying for authorizations, companies must show that their project is necessary and desirable, and several factors go into showing this. We had argued that Tetra4 had not properly shown that Cluster 2 was necessary or desirable, and this was because they had not properly assessed the potential adverse economic impact of the project. Leanne spoke earlier about stranded assets and how gas projects, for the most part, are likely to become stranded assets where the economic value cannot be returned, or the investment into these companies will likely never be got back. We also had questions about the necessity of gas. Lots of fossil fuel lobbyists will say that gas should be a transition fuel, but all the evidence points against that. For the most part, falling costs of renewables, et cetera, et cetera. We also pointed out the shifting landscape. Leanne touched on how the developing nations are likely to shift away from gas usage by 2030. We'll probably see a plateau at that point, and by 2050, we'll probably see the lowest demand for gas from the global north. Its report also failed to consider alternatives. They had not looked at the possibility of renewable energy taking the place of their proposed project, and also the no-go alternative, where companies should look at the position that the environment would be in if they were not to proceed with the project at all, was not assessed by TETRA4. So we had said that they had not properly conducted a need and desirability assessment. We also looked at the impact on agriculture and the food sector and livelihoods attached to these sectors. Now, Virginia in the Free State is considered the food basket of South Africa. A lot of our produce comes from the Free State, lots of corn and other agriculture. TETRA4 had not properly assessed the impact of Cluster 2 transplanting this vital sector. Tourism also is a big part of the Free State's economy, and the impact of any gas project on tourism was not properly assessed. Attached to this is the impact on the livelihoods linked to these sectors. Farm workers, farm dwellers, people who work in the tourism sector, their livelihoods would likely be displaced as a result of any gas project occurring, especially one as big as Cluster 2, that wasn't adequately assessed. And lastly, we had quite a novel argument. We had argued that it is irrational to authorize gas projects when South Africa doesn't have the capacity to ensure compliance with the law and compliance with the conditions attached to the licenses given to these companies. For context, South Africa currently only has 90 officials who are tasked with going out to these mining operations and ensuring that the companies are complying with the conditions in the licenses and with relevant law. Of the 90 officials, not a single one is allocated towards gas companies. So what does that mean? A gas company can get a license and there will be no one that will go to their site and ensure that they're complying with the conditions in that license or with the relevant environmental laws. It's basically a situation where it's a Wild West where they can get a license and do whatever they want under the guise that nobody's watching. With regards to these arguments, on the 1st of August 2024, the Minister of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment handed down judgment where he, in essence, set aside TETRA4's environmental authorization for Cluster 2, and he ordered them to resubmit their application after revising 2 reports, right? After revising the entire application, but with a specific focus on 2 reports. The first one is the groundwater impact assessment, where the minister ordered them to conduct a more comprehensive assessment. In essence, he agreed with our arguments that TETRA4's initial specialist study regarding groundwater impacts was inadequate and ordered them to redo that. Secondly, he upheld the argument around climate change and the argument that their TETRA4's climate change impact assessment was not comprehensive as called for in the government's judgment, and asked that they redo that. So in essence, this was a big win for our clients, but also for the environmental justice movement at large. We saw the government uphold core constitutional rights because he had also called for the public to be consulted when they TETRA4 redo their report, but also upheld the important mandate of companies ensuring that they don't exacerbate climate change, ensuring that they adequately assess any reports that speak to climate change. I'm seeing I've got a minute left, so I will hand it back to Leanne, I believe.
Thank you so much, Paul. Leanne, do you have any quick comments before we move on to SPARE?
No, thanks, Adelaide. Please do proceed. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Paul. That was really interesting. And a few questions have popped up for me that I'll ask towards the end there. One of the interesting things you mentioned was the deficient public consultation and community engagement process with these gas projects. And we understand that one of the most critical aspects of any development project, particularly energy projects, is that there be genuine engagement and involvement of the local communities. In the case of onshore gas projects, the voices of those directly affected, particularly in terms of environmental, health, and livelihood impacts, must be central to that conversation. And here today we have with us a climate and energy campaigner from Groundwork, who will reflect on the community engagement processes with Kinetiko at Amersfoort. Welcome, Sibesihle.
Thank you so much. And yeah, thank you so much for having me today. Just start by saying that, onshore gas fights show a steady escalation, as more exploration rights are being applied for across the provinces of the Free State and Mpumalanga. Now, we're seeking to pull the plug, seeking to pull the plug for Sasol's second operations as Mozambican gas fields also reach their end of life. Now, Rhino Oil and Gas, which has been spoken about in this call, following their unceremonious exit from northern KZN, has hopped over the border into the Free State with applications spanning almost the breadth of the province. Well, they've specifically stated that they will not be conducting hydraulic fracturing, also known as fracking, but they are looking for biogenic gas that naturally gathers at rock boundaries. But they fail to mention how they'll handle the wells once the biogenic gas is depleted and fracturing rock is the only means to secure ongoing production. Now, I should say that how or work that has been building on what Paul has said, is that so we went into the Free State because, well, initially the Free State because there are those Tetra 4 operations in Virginia. And so when we went in May this year, we went in and we gathered with academics, we gathered with community organizations, we gathered with fellow NGOs. And I mean, part of what we're speaking about and our ongoing conversations about how the extractive economy fares out, so how it plays out, what the usual MO is that companies will come in and it's branded as a big thing. It's branded as development. Everybody wants it. Everybody wants a job in modern day South Africa. Everybody will want to be a part of it. But what seldom gets explained is the fact that with extractive activities, you find, or with our continuous, fixation at extractive industries, you find what is commonly known in the EJ circles as the 3 E's. You find that there's, communities excluded from decision making. Paul has already been at pains to explain that point, and that is, well, common across the Free State province as well as Mpumalanga. And so far as these gas projects are concerned, communities are certainly excluded from decision making, but there's also enclosure of resources. And one point that I must just pause to make here is that what is really challenging with how these are playing out is that these gas explorations are taking place in private lands. And so it's really difficult to challenge that, because when a private land owner says, no, I'm selling, then, well, you have to think about what happens to the farm dwellers, but also you have little, to say to a private land owner who says, no, I'm selling, I'm relocating, or no, I'm selling, I have no other use for the land. So, but then there's that enclosure of resources that takes place, but also these expansive water sources that are to be used in gas projects. You find that water is now being diverted to the project and, well, over people or other agricultural production, etc. But then there comes the final E at the end, at the tail's end. You find that there's externalization of the costs. And that externalization is borne by communities, whether it be coal mining, whether it be gas mining in this instance, is that the costs will be borne or are being borne by communities. And these are ordinary communities who may not, in other instances, have recourse of saying, but what are you going to do after your operations have ceased? So that is, what the conversation has been, that, the cost is certainly going to be borne by communities. And so in the Free State, under the banner of the Free State Environmental Justice Network, we're meeting with organizations such as your Makuas and your Wamuas, Justice and Peace, your Kubiko, your Mechcons, your SAUPAs, South African Newspapers Association, all under the banner of the Free State Environmental Justice Network. We met initially in May, and we're meeting again in the coming week, so that but in our quest to formalize, but we organize, and we truly ensure that there's an informed crop of community organizations that are able to resist dirty energies and that are able to advance community interests. So that is what I thought I'd mention.
Sorry to cut you off.
Sure.
Thank you to cut you off, Spare. I just want to ask a few questions because we are under quite a tight schedule. But what you said is very interesting, and I'd like to ask a question on, in the work that you're doing with all those organizations in the Free State, what have you found to be perhaps the best mechanisms to ensure that community engagement is in fact genuine and is practical? And I think maybe you can just reflect on that and we can answer in the end. And another question is, how do we bridge the gap between reports like this one and the technical information contained therein and actual practical action on the ground from communities? So I think those are just the very two important points, is that we don't want this information to exist in a silo, but rather be very practical. And speaking of information, this report's main aim is to contextualize the financial information of these projects. Understanding the financing behind these projects is crucial for assessing their long-term viability, the risks to investors, the potential economic and environmental costs, and a multitude of other factors. So this financial insight is key to understanding the broader implications of gas development in South Africa, so that we can fully understand the challenges towards economic benefits as well as to the environment. And on that note, I will introduce Armando and welcome him to please speak on the financial information contained in the report on the project. Also, just reminding everyone that a link to the report is in the chat so that you can follow along with any of the nitty-gritties of the data. Armando, welcome.
Thank you, Addie. I'd like to kind of start from what Sven was saying. Communities are the ones carrying the cost and are usually excluded from the decision making. And we see this concern in the communities. And that was one of our main objectives in this report. We say, if you can't tackle a problem or you can't go up against a gas company if you don't have the right information. And it's sadly not only technical information that is needed, but it's a financial information that is needed to understand the instruments being used to finance these projects. And it's also critical to kind of demystify the financing and understand the risk that not only will be borne by the community, like Sven mentioned, but will also be borne by the greater economy and the financiers, because a lot of these projects are usually funded with public funds. So before we jump into that, this really highlights the need for transparency in projects, not only technical, but also financial. Sadly, we've found, as we've mentioned, and I saw a lot of the questions come in, that even though requests are being made, they're not always brought forward. So what I want to do is kind of go over the very highlight level information of the finance information we found that is all in very good detail in the report, but bring it home and say, how can this information be used by communities and civil society to challenge the financiers or the investors, the shareholders behind these gas projects, and the policymakers and the government that are funding these projects. So in this slide, I've kind of just wanted to mention the main economic and financial risk associated with gas projects, and that is that these have a very high capital requirement. They take very long to develop, and so that means that this big amount of money and these massive infrastructure run the risk of being stranded. And what that means is we're investing in more fossil fuels, and we're locking in that money and we're diverting it away from renewable energy. And not only that, gas specifically is very volatile. And as Leanne mentioned, we can already start to see the demand fall away. So we have to ask ourselves, is it really worth it? Now, we've been talking about Kinetiko and Tetra 4. I won't go into much detail of the size and the financiers. This is all information you can find in the report already. But what I do want to highlight with this is, in order, like I said, in order to deal with this, you need to understand who owns it, who's lending money to it, who benefits from these projects, and most importantly, who's making the decision. So we call all of these people the stakeholders, and it's everyone from the banks and the institutions funding them to the management of these companies who most of the time hold shares and are making the decisions. So in the case of both Kinetiko and Tetra 4, or Renergen rather, these are public companies, which means they're publicly listed, which means they're very susceptible to the price and what the market thinks of them. And we can exploit that by attending AGMs and doing shareholder activism. Because if we raise these questions, the market will realize, hey, they're not being transparent. And someone in the question, I saw someone saying, about the CEO of Renergen giving false information or at best misleading. And it's our duty to highlight that misleading and let the market know that this is actually not as profitable as they're sharing. Now, another important thing here is to notice that in both projects, Kinetiko and Tetra 4, there's the presence of public finance institutions and development finance institutions. Mainly, we can see the IDC, South Africa's development for the industry, and the PIC as a shareholder in Tetra 4. So it's important to highlight that these are public institutions that are using public funds to finance gas projects. In the case of Kinetiko, it is one of two. It is the only financier, and we can see that. So we can pressure these public finance institutions to say, you're using public money that could be put to better use, and you're locking us in even more into fossil fuels. So the key message that I kind of want to drive is that there is an immense risk, not only for the community and for the environment, but for the investors in gas projects. And when these investors are public finance institutions like the IDC or the PIC, or even international ones like the American DFC, they're using public funds that are in risk of not bringing the profit that they're promising. So, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, these high capital requirements are usually made upfront, and then they're locked in because it takes a lot of time to develop these pipelines and the exploration. We saw the delays in phase 1 of Tetra 4. And then even once they're up, if the decline of if the demand of gas is going down, these assets are going to be stranded. Millions, billions of dollars and rands just in infrastructure that will no longer be useful in the future. I mentioned cost volatility because gas prices are subject to geopolitical tensions, market supply and demands, and also speculation. And this can leave not only users of gas, and the investors and the companies in a very precarious situation. Now, we've been talking about the environmental dangers of it, but these also have a cost in terms of financial, because they can lead to legal disputes and to delays, like we've seen in the case of Tetra 4. So it's important for financiers and for communities to understand all of this when, you know, we make our arguments against these projects. What's even more alarming is that these companies are not being transparent. The PFIs that are funding these projects are not being transparent and are not giving the information of what due diligence process were followed, not only for environmental, but financial as well. So it just highlights the importance of in order to tackle this problem, we need the technical side, we need the communities, but we need to understand the financial background in order to paint a holistic, to paint it in a holistic manner and present the problem from all fronts. I'll stop there and see if there's any questions.
Thank you so much, Armando. From reading the report and from what you've said, I am fully understanding that these projects are unsustainable. So, or perhaps I overconflate, but this is what I'm understanding. And based on that, how realistic is it then to have a landscape where fossil gas is continuing to be invested in, especially as a transition fuel in a country like South Africa? Because surely the current market condition does not support it. And from what the report says and what you've shared, the future projections are also quite low. So I think that's quite an interesting question. And jumping off from there is then, in your experience, what do you think is the most effective strategy for us to be challenging the financiers? Because like you said, we have to take a holistic and multi-pronged approach, not just legal, but also challenge where the money is coming from, especially when the money is made up of public funds. So this is an issue that I don't think we face only in South Africa, but I think it might be applicable regionally as well, because when we're speaking about, you know, this energy transition we want to have, we often hear the word just. So the question then is just for who and how? And from our discussion so far, I think maybe we're leaning in a particular direction, but this question requires an answer that is localized as well as regional. And to do this for us, I will welcome Bekumuzi Dean Bebe from Don't Gas Africa. He is the Senior Just Transition and Campaigns Advisor for PowerShift Africa and the Don't Gas Africa campaign. He will now guide us through the campaign as well as offer a regional perspective on the climate, social, economic, and environmental risks associated with gas projects in Africa, with a particular focus on how we can begin to bridge the gap between local and regional strategies and perhaps have a strategy that works broadly for everyone, because the projects do keep coming up and we cannot challenge all of them on a case-by-case basis. So with that said, Dean, please take over.
Thanks so much, Adelaide, and thank you so much for having me in this important webinar. I think the questions you've posed are very critical and very important, given that, you know, Africa is at a critical juncture where we have over about 20,000 kilometers of gas pipelines and approximately 30 gas extraction zones, which are in various stages of planning and development, which is a significant portion of this gas really is destined for export, which really does then challenge the notion that gas serves as a transitional energy source. And what's important, and something that's been highlighted from previous speakers, firstly, I think, is we can look at this in a manner, particularly from a finance perspective, as financial fraud, in the sense that we are committing to pushing in investments into an infrastructure that would be, again, the buzzword, a stranded asset within the next 10 to 20 years, essentially, instead of investing, I guess, in renewable energy now. So there's been a big movement, particularly from the Don't Gas Africa campaign, where we serve as a housing agent for over 700 CSOs across the African continent to ensure that we're not locked in a fossil gas production future. But one of the pillars that we work through is the public finance pillar, and one of the biggest calls under that pillar is for a fossil fuel finance exclusion policy to be operationalized from development financial institutions such as the World Bank and the African Development Bank. And we've seen different forms of that manifest, but we haven't seen the operationalization of a fossil fuel finance exclusion policy that will pave way and give right for renewable energy investment to thrive. Because as mentioned, the climate science is quite clear that, new oil and gas deposits should not be developed. And this must be essentially rapidly phased down if we're to remain, in line with our global targets. But we do see, a lot of the oil gas fields on the African continent increasingly attracting attention, from Mauritania to Senegal, where we've seen even in Senegal in-house that all the coastal communities are facing a food insecurity crisis as a result of a deteriorating marine ecosystem, right? Because of gas exploration off the coast. We're looking at Nigeria to Mozambique, Angola, and South Africa. And the exploitation of gas deposits is essentially accompanied by the promises of prosperity, and usually the same indicators: economic, social, environmental. And this disregards the complete climate collapse that we're all experiencing. And essentially, we have locked ourselves in a cycle where we've prioritized fossil fuel extraction for export, especially in its raw, unprocessed form. And African nations have now tapped in the role of resource suppliers to being resource suppliers to industrial countries, while simultaneously serving as a market for finished products manufactured abroad. And this is how the neo-colonial model functions. And this is where we see the trap, where we continue to see Africa being reduced to being simply a gas station for other colonial powers. And in this system, African communities again bear the full brunt of the social and environmental devastation caused by this fossil fuel extraction, and yet they receive none of the benefits of the industrial or supposed equitable economic growth. So the so-called developed world transitions away from fossil fuels, enabled by the immense transfer of wealth from Africa. Then African countries essentially will be left, again, as I mentioned, with stranded assets and gas reserves that will become financial liabilities, further locking us in debt and dependence on the very forces that are exploiting them. And the environmental costs of extraction, including pollution, displacement, destruction of ecosystems, will only really exacerbate the suffering. So this has become like a resource curse that has essentially ravished countries across the continent. Nigeria is a good example, Africa's largest crude oil producer, and is also the continent's largest importer of refined petroleum. And despite the Dangote refinery recently becoming operational, this imbalance is still grounded in a systematic lack of domestic refining capacity, driven by foreign control over energy sources and the refusal, essentially, to invest in local infrastructures. And the result is spiraling debt crises, compounded by environmental degradation and mass poverty, to even the extent that the Conte refinery in Nigeria, for example, cannot fix. And despite Nigeria's vast oil wealth and only a tiny elite benefits, and only a tiny elite of people benefit from that system, while the vast majorities continue to suffer. I mean, at the Niger Delta, the life expectancy is at 41 years old, and that should be shocking. In Angola, another country that's rich in resources, the situation is quite similar. Angola's oil wealth has enriched foreign companies like Total and Chevron, while leaving the population mired in poverty, which brings the question around, yes, finance is the key, but we also need to talk around local ownership as well. Kinetiko is owned by Australia. Woodside in Senegal is owned by Australia again. We've got many other companies, Total Energies, and it's in cahoots with the French government. We do see a high rise of different countries who run fossil fuel corporations that are not primarily African owned. So the notion that essentially we can use revenue to actually achieve fundamental developmental building blocks is essentially false. If you look at Senegal, 76.6% of the GDP services debt. Nigeria is at 65%, Mozambique is at 74%, Uganda is at just a little over 50%. Of the GDP that the country earns annually has to be servicing debt, essentially. And fossil fuel entrenchment does not necessarily help us in that regard. So we see us metamorphosizing into a space where, despite decades of fossil fuel-oriented growth, as they would like to call it, since the liberation era, African nations continue again to be at the bottom of the global value food chain. And this model has fundamentally been rooted across the continent and is pursued and reproduced by different entities, and DFIs play an essential role in that. And I guess we are now at a point where African countries cannot continue to struggle with the endless cycles of sovereign debt, for example, that tend to weaken the degree of economic and monetary sovereignty and the fiscal policy space necessary to tackle national priorities such as health, education, infrastructure, and other public services, which are the essential building blocks of development. Rather, this process then forces African countries to accept punitive loan conditionalities that weaken the state, hurt the most vulnerable, and lock countries into further dependence on external financing. So in closing, like, African countries cannot, again, continue on this path to reproduce extractive economic models that have destroyed the ecosystems and resulted in food and energy insecurity, poverty, socioeconomic exclusion, and conflicts, as well as other ecological distractions. African economies continue to be locked at the bottom of global value food chain since colonial times, and we cannot continue to be the continent, again, that provides this cheap raw material. But in order for us to deal with the climate crisis and development challenge in Africa, we need to tap into the existing potential, such as the abundant renewable energy sources, to establish economic and resilient systems. But what needs to be at the center of this is the African financing landscape, which shows that the quantity of finance flows are inadequate relative to its needs and do not contribute to the enabling justice in the transition. The second aspect is the multilateral development banks, who are the primary drivers of climate-related finance flows, mainly debt to African governments. And also China as well is also a huge lender on the continent, and this has to be highlighted quite prominently. Now, the dignity of finance provided to the continent is quite poor, as the flows are not equitably distributed in Africa, but rather concentrated in a few regions. And surprise, surprise, Egypt, Morocco, Nigeria, South Africa, Mozambique, all gas countries right now. So further evidence is that despite commitments to quantums and quality, countries continue to experience many roadblocks in dignified access to actually commit resources in making any progress to climate goals. Thus, the quality of finance, as expressed in terms and in the terms and conditionalities of what it means when we say quality finance, they are unfortunately debt focused, which constrain the fiscal capacity of African countries. And finally, in closing, what I think we now need to do is to create a synergized threaded effort, essentially, where we have, for example, institutions like CER taking the legal route, but that is essentially not enough. We need to start producing reports that can be accepted. For example, in court proceedings, they're not just viewed as postulations, but rather viewed as something that has been scientifically proven that gas is not a transition fuel, amongst other fossil fuels, right? So the IPC has a role to play, academia has a role to play, and all this can be fueled by robust and impactful campaigns. So we do have this essential coalition called the African Finance Watch that's going to be launching in the next few months. And we hope to create this synergetic effort where we can provide and fund adequate and robust, impactful, and somewhat validated resources that can be used by environmental justice legal firms that can also then cause a ripple effect, where we even have a point where judges are being trained to actually understand what we mean by the relationship between climate, energy, and development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. That was amazing and very, very informative. Before we move on to our main Q&A portion, which I suppose this forms part of, I was very interested by this this phrase that you used, synergized threaded effort. And I wonder, to what extent can we have due diligence campaigns along the value chain of these natural gas companies, from where the gas is extracted all the way to the end user in the Western world, in the industrialized world, like you said. Because based on what the information you've provided, it does seem like there's a form of green colonization, and that perhaps to a certain extent, climate financing for these projects, these so-called transition energy projects, is giving into this idea of colonization and imperialism and neocolonialism. So I thought that was quite interesting and something that perhaps we can discuss a little further. And on that note, I would love to thank our panelists very much for this discussion thus far. We're not quite done. We're scheduled to continue until 1:30. So I'd like to open the floor up to any questions, any live questions, as well as any questions in the Q&A that we can answer, as well as give the panelists just time to respond to the follow-up questions I had posed. If you don't remember them, just flag it for me and I'll try and provide you with the question again. And I think we can just start with Dean as the latest to respond. Dean?
Hi, thanks, Adelaide. I'm not quite sure you want me to answer a question that's been posed in the Q&A section.
No, I'll just I'll see. Can someone help me with the Q&A just so I can see what's up there? I think while we just find that is I'm wondering, about this idea of synergized threaded effort and what you view is perhaps the role of organizations like CER or other campaigns that are based in the Western world in Europe, and perhaps having some coordinated efforts within what we're doing in each country, as well as what we're doing regionally and what they're doing in their space. Because it does seem like there is a need for a bit of coordinated effort that on our own, as both the supplier as well as the body that bears all the cost, we would need, without sounding like we need assistance, but we would need, a coordinated effort from all fronts.
Yeah, sure, thanks. I think I want to give the example of Senegal, because I think that's the most recent one that we've been involved in. So the German government was trying to push for investments within, the Republic of Senegal. And essentially because we didn't want, the Senegalese people to go through another yet gas investment, given what, the Sangomba phase of oil had done to the country, essentially. We realized that there was a need for this synergized, robust effort that is threaded. And what we did was we first created a coalition between Senegalese activists and German activists. And they started talking and sharing notes, essentially. And we had this cross-cultural where we saw a lot of the activists from Germany going to Senegal and Senegalese activists going to Germany. But when this was really conducted as well, we reached out to parliamentarians to actually come and do an independent review of the impacts of gas exploration in St. Louis in Senegal, for example. So we got the Green Party from Germany to come through and they did this independent review, but it wasn't just the Green Party because they were actually on our side. We also asked the Democrat Party in Germany to also do an independent review. What this then happened is it created a legislative effort in Parliament where they had on-the-ground experience as to what was going on. We had individuals like natural justice training communities on the legal aspects around how their rights are being violated on the ground, while we had activists pushing for a legislative transformational framework coming out from the German government. And essentially what that did in the long run is Germany called off that investment into Senegal. Unfortunately, they jumped over to Nigeria, which was something that wasn't in our radar, but the synergized effort that came from lawyers, activists, and parliamentarians coming together to push, and that's also being hosted on a coalition, or rather a platform, which in that time was the Senegal German People's Alliance, essentially proved that synergized efforts do work. That also then propelled an effort between European gas activists and African gas activists, where they did a huge action at the European Gas Conference, where most gas convenings are held in Vienna. And essentially, there were about 7,000 activists present to push back on that. And 3 years of doing that, essentially with having Africans going there every year to protest. This year, for example, the European Gas Conference was cancelled. I mean, that Total, Chevron, so Eni did not essentially come together in one room to discuss how they can geopolitically leverage resources on the African continent, as that was the main event where they actually got to do that. And because of those synergized efforts, that event was essentially announced as cancelled. Of course, they cited fears that they would probably be, hurt as a result of angry activists, but essentially we got to the goal, which was to essentially cancel and stop the European Gas Conference. And again, it was that synergized effort between African activists and European activists. I hope I've mildly answered you, but I'm happy to do a deep dive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean. That was a really great comprehensive answer, but also, sort of showing us the game of whack-a-mole that we're playing and the need for a tighter strategy, because just jumping from country to country. And on this topic of having the people speak to the things that affect them, I'd like to invite Spare, if you will, please, just for us to go back to the question of what would the best practices be for ensuring that community voices are not only heard, but integrated into the decision-making process around these projects, but also very importantly, how can we ensure that reports like this report are useful to communities? How do we bridge the gap between this very technical information and actual practical action on the ground? And I'm sorry, and so sorry for all the other speakers who are going to answer, if we could just limit it to maybe a minute and a half, please. Thank you. Sorry, Sipe, we can't hear you. We'll just move on to the next question for you, Leanne, while Spare grapples with technology. The floor is yours, Leanne.
No, thanks so much, Adelaide. I actually had a question for Spare, and I hope he can hear me. I had a question for Spare around whether, for the Tetra 4 project, for example, they themselves have said, look, this is a highly mechanized process in terms of gas extraction. And so there aren't going to be a lot of jobs created as a result of this project. And so I wanted to hear from Spare on whether community members or, those that are being consulted are provided with enough information about the jobs issue. And I think maybe I'll hand over to Paul, who wants to answer one of the questions live. Thanks, Adelaide.
Thanks, Leanne.
Yeah.
Paul, you could jump in.
Sure, thanks. I'm just seeing in the chat, somebody said, with a references statement by the Renergen CEO, Stefano Morani, where he said after the appeal and the setting aside of the EA, he said, and I quote, the appeal has not resulted in any delays to the progress on phase 2, nor is it likely to have any impact on the timing of phase 2. This is due to the fact that our select drilling program is fully authorized under the production right granted in 2012. End quote. And the attendee said that the statement is misleading at best. I just wanted to address that in the context of the reactions of Tetra 4 after the decision by the minister to set aside the EA. I think a lot of the reactions initially was a lot of corporate spin, a lot of trying to sustain shareholder confidence and downplay the impact of the decision. I think it should be made very clear that the setting aside of the EA has completely halted and stalled any plans they have to drill in terms of cluster 2, or to drill a single of the additional 300 proposed wells. And anything that says otherwise is complete corporate spin. We have engaged with our other partners in other private law firms who have acted for landowners in opposing Tetra 4's proposed expansion. And there were discussions about, in some way, reporting or basically reporting such statements to the JSE, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, or the ASX, the Australian Stock Exchange, where Tetra 4 is listed, in terms of potential misrepresentations to shareholders, which is at best unethical. So yeah, just to answer that question, I fully agree that the statements by the CEO initially were misleading at best.
Paul, just a follow-up question while we're still waiting for Spare to join us and respond to Leanne's question. You mentioned something very interesting. I believe it was the pilot production project, and that you're having some engagements with the company. So my question is, are your engagements sort of to gain some clarity on what that all entails? Or is it to get some sort of regulatory transparency, or to have a change in regulatory practices so that such a thing is included in the law? I seem to recall you had said that this is not something provided for in our law.
Thanks, Adelaide. No, absolutely. So the law either provides for exploration rights or production rights. So if a company holds an exploration right, they can't produce anything. So to have a company do pilot production with an exploration right, in our minds, is contrary to the existing laws. So our engagements with the regulator, PASA, the Petroleum Agency of South Africa, was to just ascertain exactly what Kinetiko means by pilot production, and whether or not PASA is aware of that, and if Kinetiko are authorized to do such. Because the law is quite clear, you either can explore or produce, but you can't have an exploration right and produce under that exploration right.
Thank you so much, Paul. I'm going to just jump over to Armando to answer a few questions.
Sure. Well, I think Sve is having some technical difficulties. He's trying to reconnect. And to the questions that you had done, Addie, about how profitable are these projects and can we trust their projections? It all comes back to, well, actually, given their track record, my immediate answer would be no, they're not. Given what we're seeing in the market, given the demand of gas, but also because we don't have the full picture. We don't have the transparency to see exactly how is it that they're projecting and what is it that they're projecting. Our experience also tells us that they're not taking environmental risks seriously enough, and this is causing delays, and that translates into more loss of financial return. To your question about what is the best strategy for financiers, it really depends on who you're dealing with. Like I said, private sector companies, especially banks, and those that are publicly listed are very susceptible to public opinion. So our best strategy there has been shareholder activism, in which we acquire one share, which gives us access to the AGM, and we pose these questions to them. And this is exactly what happened when we went to the AGM of Renergen. We asked very specific questions to the CEO, and he said what Paul quoted earlier just now. He also said that they're trying to do an initial public offering in NASDAQ in the US. And we're saying, well, how can you do an initial public offering in the US when your shareholders in South Africa and in the US have lost their investment more than half times? Their stock has plummeted. On top of that is like, how is the Security Exchange Commission in the US going to give you the permission to launch an IPO when you clearly have environmental regulations and legal proceedings against you? So we see a very clear strategy that is actually working. And with PFIs like IDC, PIC, and even American development finance like the DFC, they have grievance mechanisms. They're public institutions that should be posting all of the information about their environmental and social reports, about their due diligence reports, but they're not. And it's our job to pressure them and ask for that information. And when they deny it, make it public that they're not sharing that information.
Thank you so much, Armando. Sve, are you back with us? I think Sve is still gone. And on the aspect of information, and I'll open the floor up to participants as well as our panelists, is how do you envision we use this report, which is a question I posed to Sve, but I think we can open it up a bit more, is within your capacity as either civil society, member of industry, policymakers, how do you envision having this contextualized financial information about these gas projects or any other projects we may do a deep dive on, how do you envision that this information will be helpful within your work, your advocacy? And please, the floor is open to anyone who's willing to jump in there.
Adelaide, I wonder if Spey is still on. He might have dropped out. But maybe I can address some of that question, Adelaide. And I think, yeah, Dean, go ahead, Dean, and then I'll come in after Dean. Thanks.
Thanks. I think for me, like, this report is super awesome, but I think what's important is we need to start building power. And essentially, if there's very little understanding between the relationship between public finance, the climate crisis, and development, essentially. And I think what this report can do can be a fundamental foundation towards a lot of the toolkits that we could probably do to help communities understand, how gas is not a transition fuel, essentially. It really does form, I think, for us as Don't Gas Africa, a big foundation in establishing, a robust ground where we can actually begin the meaningful work in not only just empowering communities, but having these discussions amongst the wider network and the wider movement with different CSOs. So, I do think that there are very few people on the African continent who can speak towards the relationship between public finance and the implications with energy security, and do that in a very informed and in a power building manner. And I think this report can help us start doing that groundwork in order for us to empower and raise more activists who are able to speak on these issues more concisely. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dean. And, we're definitely looking forward to the launch of Africa Finance Watch, because our experience, here in South Africa, and we have the Fair Finance Coalition, for example, is that you do need an organization, a campaign that bridges the gap between some of the technical information that is seemingly, difficult to understand, and being able to develop campaigns and strategies around that. So we're definitely looking forward to that launch and engaging more. And I know that Spey is having some technical difficulties, but I think, from previous conversations with Spey, one of the key things that, and groundwork colleagues generally, one of the key things that have been raised is we need to be looking quite carefully at how we present some of this information. So can we develop particular fact sheets, or if we're speaking about financiers, make the logical connection ourselves so that communities do know, okay, we can register as shareholders, participate in shareholder activism, lodge grievance complaints against the Development Finance Corporation in the US, for example, use different mechanisms, go to the JSC and complain to them about misleading statements. We've had a conversation on the chat about this. So, so many mechanisms available, but you need to first be able to understand the various stakeholders, which I hope we've managed to provide some insight on today, at least in relation to these two gas projects. And I hope that this has been a really useful conversation. Sorry, Adelaide, I used that opportunity also just to make some closing remarks. Thanks.
No, thank you so much, Leanne. We've answered, I believe we've answered all the questions that were in the Q&A. If anyone would like to take the opportunity to ask a question now, please just go ahead. Just give that 30-second pause for any questions. Okay, 30 seconds is too long. I'm going to hop on. So thank you for those closing remarks, Leanne. And I will wrap up our discussion a bit more. And if anyone has any further questions after this, please do feel free to reach out to us. Can someone put contact details in the chat? We're going to put some contact details in the chat so we can have further discussions offline. And so as we come to the end of today's important discussion, I think it's important to highlight how a report like this one can help us to understand the challenges surrounding onshore gas projects in South Africa. It provides a very clear outlook on the financial, environmental, and social aspects of these projects, making it potentially a very essential resource for advocacy and informed decision-making. As Dean had said, there's an opportunity for some capacity building on the ground using a report like this. What I found was very important from our discussion is that the findings stress the need for more transparency, more coordination, and to use Dean's word, which I'm going to steal from now on, synergized efforts between government, industry, community groups, as well as local residents. Also, what's important is that understanding financing of these projects, it's so crucial, because once you understand who is investing, what risks are involved, and how these investments can impact the community and environment, it enables us to challenge them effectively in a holistic manner. As we've been saying throughout, it's that law on its own is not enough. It's the financing, advocacy work, it's the capacity building in the ground and community engagement. So I think that's very, very important. And what's another really interesting thing is that a report like this one, and we hope that our report does this, is that it can spark some conversation and encourage people to think quite critically about the effects of the energy choices that are being made by governments on local communities and the environment. And quite critically, it reminds us that we must prioritize the voices and rights of those most affected by these projects, and digging deep into the financials and contextualizing them through that lens will help us to really address environmental and social risks of these projects. So as we move forward, I would like to invite us all to use the insights from this report to push for fair energy solutions for both people and planet, and that we can continue to work together. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, thank our esteemed panelists for engaging so much on this report, and I'd like to thank our participants for making the time. So thank you everyone for your participation and your dedication to these important issues. And with that, I will say, I think there's still enough time for lunch.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Everyone.
Cheers, everyone.